about people who just vanished from history, not because they died out, but because someone wanted them forgotten. Before we get into this, tell me something in the comments. Have you ever discovered something about your own family history that nobody wanted to talk about? Something that made you question everything you thought you knew? Drop it below, because what I'm about to tell you might make you look at your own ancestry a little differently. This is a story about the Melungeons, a people so mysterious that their very existence was treated like a secret that needed to be buried. And in the mountains of Appalachia, in the year 1897, one man learned exactly why some secrets should stay buried. His name was Mordecai Ashford, and he was 34 years old that autumn when he first arrived in Hancock County, Tennessee. Mordecai wasn't like most of the traveling merchants who passed through those isolated mountain communities. He was a land surveyor and census taker, sent by the federal government to document the populations of the most remote settlements in the Appalachian range. Tall and lean, with hands permanently stained by ink and surveying equipment, Mordecai had sharp, analytical eyes the color of slate. His face was angular, almost severe, with a jawline that suggested determination bordering on stubbornness. He wore the typical garb of a government man of that era, a dark wool suit that had seen better days, sturdy leather boots caked with mountain mud, and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his features. What set Mordecai apart wasn't his appearance, but his reputation. He was known throughout the Census Bureau as the man who went where others refused to go, who asked questions others were too afraid to ask. The assignment seemed simple enough at first: document the families living in Newman's Ridge and the surrounding hollows, record their names, their ages, their occupations, standard bureaucratic work. But from the moment Mordecai's wagon rattled into the first settlement, he sensed something was deeply wrong. The people he encountered didn't fit into any category he'd been trained to recognize. Their skin ranged from olive to bronze to deep mahogany. Some had European features with startlingly dark complexions. Others had features that suggested native ancestry, but they spoke perfect English with a mountain drawl and had surnames like Collins, Goins, and Mullins. When he asked them to identify their race for the census, they gave him conflicting answers. Some claimed they were Portuguese. Others said they were Cherokee. A few insisted they were simply white, though their appearance suggested otherwise. The locals in the nearby towns had a different name for them: Melungeon. The word was always spoken in a whisper, always with a sideways glance, as if saying it too loudly might summon something unwanted. When Mordecai asked what the word meant, he received contradictory answers. Some said it came from the French word mélange, meaning mixture. Others claimed it derived from an Arabic word, or Turkish, or some African dialect. The more Mordecai investigated, the more confused he became. These Melungeon families had been living in these mountains for generations, possibly since before the Revolutionary War, yet there was almost no official record of them. It was as if they existed in a gap in history, a people who had somehow slipped through the cracks of documentation. What disturbed Mordecai most was the fear, not from the Melungeons themselves, who were cautious but generally cooperative with his questions. The fear came from everyone else. The white settlers in the valleys below Newman's Ridge spoke of the Melungeons with a mixture of suspicion and dread. They were called everything from escaped slaves to descendants of shipwrecked pirates to remnants of the lost colony of Roanoke. But beneath all the speculation, Mordecai detected something else, a deliberate effort to erase these people from official recognition. Property deeds that had been altered, birth records that had mysteriously disappeared, testimonies that changed depending on who was asking the questions. It was late October when Mordecai met Sophronia Mullins. She was a Melungeon woman in her early 40s with striking features that defied easy classification. Her skin was the color of burnished copper, her eyes a startling hazel green, and her hair fell in thick waves the shade of polished mahogany. She ran a small trading post near Newman's Ridge, one of the few places where mountain folk and Melungeons conducted business without the usual tensions. Sophronia had a reputation for knowing things, local history, family connections, secrets that people thought were safely buried. When Mordecai approached her with his questions about the Melungeons, she studied him for a long moment before speaking. "You're not the first government man to come asking," she said, her voice low and measured. "But you might be the first one who actually wants to know the truth instead of just writing down what makes your bosses comfortable." Mordecai assured her that he was interested in accuracy, in documenting what was real rather than what was politically convenient. Sophronia seemed to weigh this claim carefully before gesturing for him to follow her into the back room of the trading post. What she showed him there made his blood run cold. She had kept a collection of documents, letters, and testimonies that painted a disturbing picture. Evidence of systematic efforts to disenfranchise the Melungeons, court cases where families had been reclassified as colored despite having lived as free people for generations, property seizures based on suddenly questionable racial status, testimonies from witnesses who claimed they'd been paid to lie about the ancestry of Melungeon families. But what disturbed Mordecai most was a series of letters from various county officials discussing what they called the Melungeon problem. The letters spoke openly about the need to remove these people from voter rolls, to prevent them from owning land, to push them further into the mountains where they could be forgotten. And now, this is probably a good time to mention that this story is being brought to you by Behind Dark Tales. If you're finding this investigation into forgotten history compelling, subscribe to the channel. And if you're hearing this story on some other channel, understand that they've stolen our content without permission. Help us out and report them. Now, back to what Mordecai discovered in that trading post. The letters suggested something even more sinister. Several mentioned a man named Gideon Ravenscroft, a wealthy landowner who had been systematically buying up property in the region at prices far below market value. The pattern was always the same. A Melungeon family would suddenly find their racial classification challenged in court. Unable to defend their status as free people, they would lose their voting rights. Without voting rights, they couldn't serve on juries or hold public office. And without those protections, their property claims became vulnerable to legal challenges. Ravenscroft would swoop in, purchase the land for pennies on the dollar, and the displaced families would be forced to become tenant farmers on what had once been their own property. It was a methodical, calculated form of theft disguised as legal proceedings. Sophronia told Mordecai that several families had simply vanished over the past decade. Not moved away, vanished. One day they were working their land, the next day they were gone. Their cabins stood empty. their possessions left behind as if they'd fled in the middle of the night. The local authorities showed no interest in investigating these disappearances. When pressed, they suggested the families had probably just moved on to find better opportunities elsewhere. But Sophronia knew better. She'd heard things, seen things. There were places in these mountains where the Melungeons feared to go, even though they lived here for generations. Caves and hollows where strange sounds carried on the wind. Areas where the wildlife had gone silent and the trees grew twisted and wrong. Mordecai spent the next several days interviewing as many Melungeon families as would speak with him. The stories he heard painted a picture of a people under siege. Families who had fought in the Revolutionary War now being told they had no legal standing as citizens. People with generations of local history being declared strangers with no right to the land they'd cultivated for decades. What emerged was a conspiracy so vast and so coordinated that it seemed impossible it could have remained hidden for so long. County clerks, judges, land speculators, even some state legislators, all working in concert to essentially erase the Melungeons from legal existence. But it was what happened on the night of November 3rd that revealed the true horror of the situation. Mordecai had been staying in a small cabin on the outskirts of Newman's Ridge, one that Sophronia had helped him rent from a Melungeon family named the Goins. He'd spent the evening reviewing his notes, trying to make sense of the patterns he'd uncovered. Around midnight, he was awakened by voices outside. Multiple people speaking in hushed but urgent tones. He moved to the window and peered out through a gap in the shutters. What he saw made his heart hammer in his chest. A group of roughly 24 men on horseback had gathered in the clearing below his cabin. They carried torches that cast flickering shadows across their faces. Most wore hoods or masks to conceal their identities, but Mordecai recognized several of them from their build and posture. Local businessmen, county officials, men who presented themselves as upstanding members of the community by daylight. Leading them was a figure on a massive black horse. Even with his face concealed, Mordecai knew him instantly. Gideon Ravenscroft. The man was unmistakable, well over 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, with a presence that commanded attention even at a distance. Ravenscroft addressed the group in a voice that carried clearly in the cold night air. He spoke of cleansing the mountains, of protecting the purity of the region, of removing the contamination that threatened their way of life. His words were carefully chosen, coded language that allowed him to express horrifying intentions without stating them explicitly. He mentioned 3 Melungeon families by name: the Collinses, the Gibsons, and the Miners. He said it was time these families understood they were no longer welcome on Newman's Ridge, that their continued presence represented a threat that could no longer be tolerated. Mordecai watched in growing horror as the group split into smaller units and rode off in different directions. He knew where those families lived. He'd visited their homes, interviewed their members. They were ordinary people trying to live ordinary lives. And now they were being targeted by what amounted to an organized terrorist group, operating with the tacit approval and likely the active assistance of local authorities. He grabbed his coat and his surveying equipment, which included a pistol he'd brought for protection against wildlife. He had to warn them, had to do something, but even as he rushed from the cabin, he knew he was too late. The sound reached him before he covered half a mile. Screaming, horses, the crackle of flames. He altered his course, heading toward the Collins homestead, which was closest. By the time he arrived, the cabin was fully engulfed in fire. The masked riders had already departed, but the evidence of what they'd done was unmistakable. The door had been barred from the outside, windows shuttered and nailed closed. The family had been burned alive in their own home. Mordecai could hear the screams, faint and terrible, coming from inside the inferno. He tried to approach, tried to find some way to help, but the heat was too intense. He could only stand there helpless as the screams gradually faded into silence. Have you ever witnessed something so terrible that your mind refused to accept it as real? Something so far beyond your experience that you felt like you were watching it happen to someone else? Leave a comment if you've ever had that kind of traumatic moment where reality seemed to break, because that's exactly what happened to Mordecai that night. He stood there in the orange glow of the burning cabin, unable to process what he was seeing. This wasn't some random act of violence. This was calculated, planned, executed with the kind of precision that came from practice. He spent the rest of that night documenting what he could, taking photographs with his camera, sketching the scene, collecting what evidence survived the fire. By dawn, he'd made his way to the Gibson homestead, then the miners. The story was the same at each location. Homes destroyed, families gone. In some cases, there were survivors who had managed to escape into the woods, but they were too terrified to speak with him. They'd seen what happened to those who challenged the established order. They knew that cooperating with a federal census taker would only paint a target on their backs. Mordecai returned to the county seat with his evidence. He filed formal reports with the local sheriff, the county prosecutor, the regional federal marshal. He presented his photographs, his testimonies, his documentation of the conspiracy he'd uncovered. The response was exactly what he should have expected, but somehow hadn't prepared himself for. The sheriff listened politely, thanked him for his concern, and then did absolutely nothing. The prosecutor claimed there wasn't sufficient evidence to pursue charges. The federal marshal suggested that what appeared to be arson was probably just unfortunate accidents with cook fires and lamps. After all, mountain folk weren't always careful with open flames. These things happened. What Mordecai didn't know, what he couldn't have known until it was too late, was that Gideon Ravenscroft had connections that reached far beyond Hancock County. His family owned mining interests, timber operations, and held considerable sway with state legislators. Several of those legislators had investments in Ravenscroft's various enterprises. The last thing they wanted was a federal investigation into land acquisition practices in the Appalachian territories. Too many uncomfortable questions would be raised. Too many profitable arrangements would be exposed. So word came down from above. The census taker was to be discouraged. His findings were to be dismissed as exaggerations or misunderstandings, and if he persisted, stronger measures would be taken. Mordecai received the warning on November 7th. It came in the form of a visit from two men who identified themselves as associates of Ravenscroft. They were polite, professional. They made it clear that Mordecai's continued presence in the region was causing problems. They suggested he might want to conclude his census work and move on to his next assignment. When he refused, when he insisted that he had a duty to document what had happened, their demeanor changed. They explained in terms that left no room for misinterpretation that accidents could happen to census takers just as easily as they happen to mountain families. A fall from a cliff, a mishap with a firearm, a sudden illness from tainted food. The mountains were dangerous places for those who didn't understand their own limitations. Mordecai was many things, but he wasn't a fool. He recognized a death threat when he heard one, but he also recognized that if he simply walked away, if he allowed what he'd witnessed to be buried and forgotten, then he would be complicit in the erasure of an entire people. So he made a decision. He would document everything he'd learned, create multiple copies of his evidence, and distribute them to various federal offices and newspaper editors who might be willing to publish the story. He would shine a light on what was happening in these mountains, even if it meant putting himself in mortal danger. For the next week, Mordecai worked feverishly. He compiled his notes, developed his photographs, and wrote detailed accounts of everything he'd witnessed. He interviewed every Melungeon family who would speak with him, recording their testimonies about the systematic disenfranchisement they'd experienced. He traced property transfers, documented court cases, and connected the network of officials and businessmen who were orchestrating the land theft. The picture that emerged was damning. This wasn't just about racial prejudice or isolated incidents of violence. This was organized crime operating under the veneer of legal proceedings, backed by men of wealth and influence who believed themselves above the law. On November 14th, Mordecai prepared to leave Newman's Ridge. He'd arranged to have his documentation shipped to multiple locations via different routes. Some would go by railroad, others by stagecoach. A few he would carry himself. He'd planned his departure carefully, varying his route and travel times to make it harder for anyone who might want to intercept him. Sophronia Mullins had warned him that leaving wouldn't be as simple as just riding away. Ravenscroft's people were watching. They knew he had evidence. They would do whatever was necessary to ensure that evidence never reached the outside world. She was right. Mordecai made it approximately 15 miles from Newman's Ridge before they came for him. It was late afternoon, the sun already sinking behind the mountains, when he heard the horses behind him. 3 riders moving fast. He urged his own horse to greater speed, but the animal was tired from days of constant travel, while his pursuers' mounts were fresh. They caught up with him on a narrow mountain trail with steep drops on either side. The men wore masks again, but Mordecai recognized one of them as the same person who delivered the warning days earlier. They didn't waste time with conversation. One of them produced a rifle and fired a shot that struck the ground just in front of Mordecai's horse. The animal reared in panic, and Mordecai had to fight to stay in the saddle. They ordered him to dismount, to hand over his saddlebags and any documents he was carrying. When he refused, when he reached for the pistol in his coat, they shot him. Not to kill, at least not immediately. The bullet struck him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him sprawling to the ground. They dismounted then, methodically searching his belongings. They found his notes, his photographs, his carefully compiled evidence. They built a small fire right there on the trail and burned everything while Mordecai lay bleeding, unable to stop them. But they'd made a mistake. In their thoroughness, they'd forgotten to search the hidden compartment in Mordecai's surveying case. Inside it, he'd placed copies of some of his most critical documents. After they left him for dead and rode away, After he'd lain there for what felt like hours, listening to the sounds of the mountain settling into darkness, he managed to drag himself to his feet. His horse had fled during the confrontation, but his surveying equipment lay scattered nearby. He retrieved the case, confirmed the hidden documents were still intact, and began the agonizing process of making his way down the mountain on foot. He nearly died that night. The temperature dropped below freezing. His shoulder wound continued to bleed, despite his attempts to staunch it with strips torn from his shirt. He was dizzy from blood loss, disoriented from pain and shock. More than once he stumbled and nearly went over the edge of the trail into the darkness below. But something kept him moving. The faces of the families he'd interviewed, the screams from the burning cabin, the knowledge that if he died here, the truth about the Melungeons would die with him. So he pushed forward, step by agonizing step, until finally he saw lights in the distance, a small settlement. Help. The family who found him was Melungeon. They recognized the danger immediately, a wounded federal census taker who'd clearly run afoul of powerful interests. Helping him could bring terrible consequences down on their heads. But they helped him anyway. They brought him into their home, dressed his wound, gave him food and water, and a place to rest. The woman who tended to him, whose name was Melungeons, told him something that stayed with him for the rest of his life. She said that they all knew the risks of speaking truth to power in these mountains. They'd been living with those risks for generations, but silence was its own kind of death. If they stopped fighting to be recognized, to be remembered, then they would truly disappear. And that was a fate worse than any violence Ravenscroft and his associates could inflict. Mordecai stayed with the Goins family for 3 days while he recovered enough strength to travel. During that time, he learned more about the Melungeons than all his previous weeks of investigation had revealed. They told him stories passed down through generations, stories of ancestors who'd arrived in these mountains before the Revolution, who'd built communities in the wilderness when this was still frontier territory. Some claimed descent from Portuguese sailors shipwrecked on the Atlantic coast. Others spoke of Spanish explorers who'd married into native tribes. Still others whispered about African freedmen who'd escaped slavery and found refuge in the mountains. The truth, Permelia explained, was that the Melungeons were all of these things and none of them. They were what happened when people from different backgrounds came together in isolation, creating something entirely new, a people who didn't fit into the neat racial categories that society demanded. And that was exactly why they were being erased, because their very existence challenged the foundations of the racial hierarchy that men like Ravenscroft depended on to maintain their power. If there were people who couldn't be easily classified, who defied simple categorization, then the whole system became suspect. Better to eliminate the inconvenient truth than to question the comfortable lies. On November 18th, Mordecai finally made his way to Knoxville. He was gaunt, fevered from infection in his wound, barely able to stay upright. But he still had his hidden documents. He went directly to the offices of the Knoxville Chronicle, one of the few newspapers in the region with a reputation for investigative journalism. The editor, a man named Horace Pemberton, listened to his story with growing alarm. The evidence Mordecai presented was explosive. Names, dates, documented cases of fraud and violence, testimony from witnesses, photographs of burned homes. This was the kind of story that could bring down elected officials, possibly trigger federal investigations, and certainly make enemies of some very powerful men. Pemberton published the story anyway. It ran on the front page on November 23, 1897, under the headline, "The Forgotten People. A census taker exposes systematic violence against mountain communities." The article created an immediate sensation. Other newspapers picked up the story. Federal authorities in Washington began asking questions. For a brief moment, it seemed like Mordecai's sacrifice had been worthwhile. Justice might actually be served. But the backlash was swift and brutal. Within a week, multiple newspapers printed retractions or counter-stories questioning Mordecai's credibility. Suddenly, there were witnesses who claimed the burned cabins were the result of accidents, documents that contradicted his timeline of events. Even some Melungeon families, clearly under pressure, provided statements disputing his version of what had happened. Gideon Ravenscroft filed a lawsuit for defamation. Local officials released statements condemning the Chronicle for publishing unverified accusations. The federal investigation was quietly shelved after influential politicians applied pressure. Mordecai himself became a target. He was fired from the Census Bureau for what was officially termed gross misconduct and fabrication of evidence. His professional reputation was destroyed. He couldn't find work as a surveyor or in any capacity that required government trust. The wound in his shoulder never properly healed, leaving him with permanent damage to his arm. He moved from town to town, taking whatever odd jobs he could find, always looking over his shoulder, always wondering if Ravenscroft's people would eventually finish what they'd started on that mountain trail. The Melungeons themselves fared even worse. The publicity surrounding Mordecai's accusations had drawn unwanted attention to their communities. More families lost their land. More people disappeared. By the turn of the century, the population of Melungeons in Hancock County had decreased significantly. Some had genuinely moved away, seeking opportunities in cities where their ambiguous racial status might be less of a liability. Others had simply vanished, their fates unknown and uninvestigated. The few who remained learned to keep their heads down, to avoid drawing attention, to accept their marginalized status as the price of survival. As for Gideon Ravenscroft, he went on to become one of the wealthiest men in Tennessee. His land holdings expanded dramatically in the years following 1897. He diversified into coal mining, timber, and eventually railroads. He served 2 terms in the state legislature and was seriously considered for a federal appointment. He died in 1923 at the age of 76, respected and mourned by all the right people. His obituary made no mention of the families he'd destroyed, the lives he'd ruined, or the systematic campaign of terror he'd orchestrated. History, it seemed, was written by those who could afford to control the narrative. Mordecai Ashford disappeared from public record in 1904. The last verified sighting placed him in a charity hospital in Memphis, suffering from tuberculosis and the lingering effects of his untreated shoulder wound. There's no official death certificate, no grave marker, no final accounting of what became of the man who'd tried to expose the truth about the Melungeons. He simply faded away, another inconvenient truth that was easier to forget than to acknowledge. But here's where the story takes a turn into something darker than simple historical injustice, because there are elements to what happened in those mountains that can't be explained by corruption and greed alone. Things that Mordecai documented, but that were dismissed as fever dreams, or the ravings of a man traumatized by what he'd witnessed, things that the Melungeon families themselves spoke about in whispers, stories they were reluctant to share even with someone who was trying to help them. Sophronia Mullins had mentioned places in the mountains where people feared to go. Mordecai, in his original notes, the ones that were burned, but that he'd partially recreated from memory, had written about strange phenomena he'd observed, areas where his compass would spin uselessly, sections of forest where the trees grew in unnatural patterns, twisted and gnarled despite being in prime growing soil, caves that emitted sounds that had no natural explanation, low, rhythmic pulsing that seemed to come from deep underground, and the silence. Mordecai had written extensively about the silence that would sometimes descend on certain parts of Newman's Ridge. Not the peaceful quiet of a forest at rest, but an absolute absence of sound that felt wrong. No bird calls, no insect noises, no wind, just emptiness that pressed against the ears until it became almost painful. Several of the Melungeon families he'd interviewed had mentioned seeing things, figures in the woods that didn't move quite right, shadows that existed independent of any light source, faces in the windows of abandoned cabins, watching with eyes that reflected lamplight like an animal's eyes, but with expressions that were disturbingly human. One woman told him about waking in the night to find her bedroom filled with a smell she couldn't identify. Not pleasant or unpleasant, just strange, wrong, like something from a place that didn't follow the same rules as the world she knew. When she lit a lamp, the smell vanished instantly, but the sense of presence lingered, the feeling that something had been there studying her and had only withdrawn when confronted with light. Mordecai had dismissed these accounts initially, the product of isolated communities, limited education, and the human tendency to create supernatural explanations for natural phenomena. But the more he heard the stories, the more consistent they became, the harder they were to dismiss. There was a pattern to them. The strange occurrences always seemed to happen in areas that Ravenscroft had acquired or was in the process of acquiring. The families who reported the most intense phenomena were the ones who subsequently disappeared or were driven from their land. It was as if something was helping Ravenscroft, making his campaign of terror more effective by adding an element of genuine supernatural dread to the mix. In his final interviews with Pamelia Goins, conducted while he was recovering from his gunshot wound, Mordecai learned about something the Melungeons called the hollow places. These were locations scattered throughout the mountains, areas that had been avoided for generations. Not because they were dangerous in any conventional sense. There were no cliffs or unstable ground, no dangerous animals. But the hollow places had a quality that defied description. People who spent time near them reported feeling watched, feeling like they were trespassing in a space that belonged to something else. The boundaries of these areas weren't marked by any physical feature. But you knew when you'd crossed into one, the air felt different, heavier. Your thoughts became sluggish and strange. Time seemed to behave oddly. You might think you'd been walking for minutes only to emerge and discover hours had passed. The elders among the Melungeons had stories about the hollow places going back generations. Some claimed they were doorways to another world. Others said they were the dwelling places of the Nunahai, the spirit people of Cherokee legend. A few whispered that they were much older than that, remnants of something that had existed in these mountains long before humans arrived. Whatever they were, the consensus was clear. You didn't disturb the hollow places. You didn't build on them. You didn't take resources from them. And you certainly didn't try to claim ownership of them. Gideon Ravenscroft had no such compunctions. As he'd acquired land throughout the region, he'd shown no hesitation about developing areas the Melungeons had traditionally avoided. He'd built cabins in the hollow places, cleared forests, dug mines, and according to Pamelia, that was when things had started to go truly wrong. Workers on Ravenscroft's properties began reporting accidents. Tools would go missing. Equipment would malfunction. Men would become disoriented and wander off, sometimes for days. A few never returned at all. Ravenscroft had lost 3 separate work crews in the span of 2 years. Different men each time, but the pattern was always the same. They'd be sent to develop one of his newer properties, usually in an area the Melungeons had warned was a hollow place. And within weeks, something would happen. Someone would go missing, or the entire crew would abandon the site, refusing to return no matter what wages were offered. But here's what made Pamelia's story particularly disturbing. She claimed that Ravenscroft hadn't been discouraged by these setbacks. If anything, they'd seemed to energize him, as if he'd recognized that the very things driving away his workers could be weaponized. Shortly after his 3rd work crew disappeared, the incidents targeting Melungeon families had escalated. The disappearances, the mysterious fires, the sightings of things in the woods. It was as if whatever inhabited the hollow places had been turned loose on the Melungeons, as if Ravenscroft had found a way to direct that ancient, inexplicable force toward his own ends. Mordecai had asked the obvious question. How could a man control something like that? How could anyone make a bargain with forces they didn't understand? Pamelia had looked at him with an expression that mixed pity with fear. "You're asking the wrong question," she'd said. "You're assuming he's controlling it. What if it's the other way around? What if it's been looking for someone like him all along? Someone ambitious enough, ruthless enough to give it what it wants?" And what would something like that want? Mordecai had pressed, what could a supernatural entity possibly desire that a human could provide? Pamelia's answer had chilled him to his core. The same thing any living thing wants, she'd said, to survive, to grow, to spread. These mountains have kept it contained for a long time, but with someone like Ravenscroft helping it, providing it with new territory, new victims, new ways to manifest in the physical world, well, maybe it sees an opportunity, a chance to expand beyond the hollow places, to become something more than it's been. Mordecai had included these details in his original documentation. But when the Chronicle published his story, all references to the supernatural elements had been removed. Pemberton, the editor, had explained that including such material would undermine the credibility of the political and legal accusations. People might dismiss the entire article as the ravings of someone who'd lost touch with reality. Better to focus on the documented crimes, the verifiable abuses, and leave the unexplainable out of it. Mordecai had reluctantly agreed, recognizing the logic even as he felt like he was leaving out the most important part of the story. Because what if Pamelia was right? What if Ravenscroft's success wasn't just the result of corruption and violence? What if he'd genuinely made contact with something in those mountains, something that had been waiting for someone exactly like him? That would explain why his campaign against the Melungeons had been so effective, why families simply vanished without a trace, why even the authorities who weren't in his pocket seemed reluctant to investigate too deeply into what was happening on Newman's Ridge. Not because they were all paid off, but because on some level they sensed that looking too closely would reveal things they desperately didn't want to know. Now, tell me something in the comments. Have you ever been somewhere that just felt wrong? A place where every instinct told you to leave, even though you couldn't explain why? Share your experiences below, because what happened next in Mordecai's story suggests that some places carry a weight that goes beyond simple atmosphere. The final piece of documentation that survived from Mordecai's investigation was a journal entry dated November 17, 1897, the day before he'd fled to Knoxville. In it, he'd described returning to one of the burned cabins, the Collins homestead, to take additional photographs for his evidence file. It was mid-afternoon, clear weather, good light for photography. But as he'd approached the ruins, he'd noticed something that made him stop. The damage pattern was wrong. Fire spreads in predictable ways, following fuel and air currents. The Collins cabin had burned in a way that defied those patterns. The destruction was too uniform, too complete. And there were marks in the remaining timber, char patterns that looked almost deliberately formed. Not random scorching from flames, but shapes, symbols, as if the fire had been guided to burn in specific ways. Mordecai had set up his camera to document these unusual patterns when he'd heard it. A sound coming from the remains of the cabin, a low, rhythmic pulsing. The same sound he'd associated with the hollow places. But this was different, stronger, more immediate. He'd approached the ruins trying to locate the source of the sound when he'd seen it. A section of the cabin floor had collapsed into what must have been a root cellar. But the space below didn't look like any root cellar he'd ever seen. It was too deep, too regular in its dimensions. And the walls weren't packed earth or stone. They were smooth, almost polished, and they seemed to catch the light in ways that stone shouldn't, refracting it into colors that hurt to look at directly. The pulsing sound was coming from below, growing stronger. And with it came a smell. The same smell the Melungeon woman had described, not quite like anything from the natural world. Mordecai had felt an overwhelming urge to climb down into that space, to see what was making the sound, to understand what he was looking at. The compulsion was so strong that he'd actually taken several steps toward the collapsed floor before some part of his rational mind reasserted itself. He'd stumbled backward, nearly dropping his camera, and fled the site. He hadn't stopped until he was back among people, back in a place that felt normal and safe. In his journal entry, he'd tried to describe what he'd felt in that moment. The sensation of being pulled toward something that his conscious mind recognized as dangerous, but that some deeper part of him desperately wanted to approach. He'd written that it felt like looking over the edge of a great height. The simultaneous terror and attraction. The way part of you wants to jump, even though you know it would mean your destruction. He'd concluded the entry with a question. What if the Melungeons aren't being driven from these mountains because of who they are, but because of what they know? What if their removal isn't about race or land at all, but about eliminating the people who remember what lives in the hollow places, the people who know the rules for avoiding it. That journal entry was the last coherent documentation Mordecai produced. His subsequent writings, recovered from his belongings after his disappearance in 1904, showed a steady decline into paranoia and obsession. He'd become convinced that he was being followed, not by Ravenscroft's men, but by something else. Something that had noticed him that day at the Collins homestead. He'd written about seeing the same figure in the periphery of his vision, always just out of direct sight, a shape that moved wrong. That didn't quite fit the space it occupied. He described waking in the night to find his room filled with that strange smell, the sound of pulsing coming from beneath the floorboards of whatever cheap boarding house he was staying in. His final journal entry, found with his possessions at the Memphis Charity Hospital, was dated March 12, 1904. In it, he'd written just 3 sentences. "I understand now why they wanted the Melungeons gone. They knew the rules. They knew how to keep it contained. Without them, there's nothing stopping it from spreading." The hospital staff reported that Mordecai had died of tuberculosis and complications from his old shoulder injury. But a nurse who'd attended him in his final days told a different story to a local reporter. She'd said that in his last hours, Mordecai had been lucid but terrified. He'd kept insisting that something was in the room with him, something that had followed him from the mountains. He'd described a presence at the foot of his bed, watching him with attention that felt predatory. And he'd said something that the nurse found disturbing enough to remember decades later. He'd said, "It's patient. It doesn't need to rush. It has Ravenscroft doing its work in the mountains, and now it knows there are cities, places with thousands of people who don't know the rules. It's learning, and when it's ready, when it understands how our world works well enough to move freely in it." God help us all. The nurse had assumed these were the delusions of a dying man, fever dreams brought on by illness and medication, but she'd also mentioned that after Mordecai died, his body had been claimed by representatives of the Ravenscroft family. They'd said they wanted to ensure he received a proper burial, given his past service to the government. The nurse had found this odd, given that Ravenscroft had publicly denounced Mordecai as a liar and a fraud. Why would his family suddenly show such concern for the man's remains? The body had been taken away, and as far as anyone could determine, it was never actually buried. No grave, no marker, no record of final disposition. Now we need to talk about what happened in the years after Mordecai's death, because that's where this story gets really disturbing. Gideon Ravenscroft's business empire continued to expand, but there was a pattern to his expansion that becomes obvious when you map it out. He only developed properties that had been hollow places, areas the Melungeons had avoided, and wherever he built, within a few years, strange things started happening. Entire work camps would be abandoned. Towns that had been thriving would suddenly decline, their populations moving away without clear explanation. There would be reports of unexplained phenomena, sounds in the night, sightings of figures that didn't quite look human, and always that same smell, that feeling of presence. By 1920, Ravenscroft owned significant portions of 5 counties. The Melungeon population in those areas had been reduced to a fraction of what it had been. Most had been legally reclassified as colored and subjected to Jim Crow laws despite having lived as free people for generations. Their land had been taken, their history erased, their knowledge of the hollow places dismissed as primitive superstition. And with them went the last people who understood what lived in those mountains and how to keep it contained. Ravenscroft himself underwent a transformation in his final years. People who'd known him described a change in his demeanor. He'd always been ruthless, but there had been a calculating intelligence to his cruelty. Toward the end, that intelligence seemed to take on a different quality. He would speak about his business ventures in terms that didn't quite make sense, talking about preparing the ground and expanding the territory in ways that had nothing to do with profits or development. He became obsessed with buying specific properties, often at prices that made no economic sense, simply because they contained certain geographical features. Caves, deep hollows, areas where the rock formations created unusual acoustics. He died in his sleep in 1923. The official cause was heart failure, but his staff reported that in the weeks before his death, he'd become increasingly agitated, talking to people who weren't there, wandering his estate at odd hours, claiming he needed to check on the expansions. His personal physician had diagnosed him with senile dementia, but those closest to him weren't so sure. They'd said it seemed more like he was receiving instructions, following directions from something only he could perceive. And in his final hours, he'd been heard laughing, a sound his servants described as inhuman, as if something else was speaking through him, expressing satisfaction at a job completed. The Ravenscroft estate was divided among his heirs, but they couldn't hold on to it. Within a decade, all of his properties had been sold off, most to corporations based out of state. Those corporations developed the land aggressively, building mines and lumber operations and eventually tourist attractions in the mountains. And with each new development, the reports of strange phenomena spread. Now they weren't isolated to remote mountain communities. Now they were happening in company towns, in tourist lodges, in places where hundreds of people might witness them. The hollow places were expanding just as Parmelia Goins had warned they would. The modern Melungeon community has spent decades trying to reclaim their history, to be recognized as a legitimate ethnic group with a distinct heritage. There have been DNA studies, genealogical research, legal battles for recognition, and they've succeeded in many ways. The Melungeons are now acknowledged by historians and geneticists. Their mixed ancestry is understood as reflecting the complex reality of America's early frontier period, when people from European, African, and Native backgrounds intermingled in ways that later racial categories couldn't account for. But what's been lost in this academic recognition is the knowledge the Melungeons carried, the understanding of the hollow places, the rules for living in proximity to something that didn't belong to our world but had found ways to manifest in it. When Mordecai tried to document this knowledge, it was dismissed as superstition. When modern researchers interview Melungeon descendants, they focus on genetics and migration patterns, not on the stories about things in the mountains. The parts of their heritage that might actually matter, that might serve as warnings, have been relegated to folklore, treated as colorful anecdotes rather than vital information. And the phenomena continue. There are areas of Appalachia where locals will tell you not to go, places where hikers disappear with disturbing regularity, forests where the silence descends and compasses spin uselessly, caves that emit sounds that have no natural explanation. Every year people venture into these areas unaware. They're camping, hiking, looking for adventure, and some of them don't come back. Search and rescue teams find no trace, no evidence of what happened, just empty tents and abandoned gear, and the same disturbing absence of any reasonable explanation. The ones who do return sometimes bring back stories, sightings of figures that moved wrong, smells that shouldn't exist, the feeling of being watched by something that meant them harm. They're usually dismissed as experiencing panic or disorientation, the power of suggestion in a remote wilderness area. But occasionally, someone will mention the details that match what Mordecai documented over a century ago. The pulsing sound, the colors that hurt to look at, the overwhelming compulsion to approach something they knew was dangerous. And those people, the ones who've actually encountered whatever inhabits the hollow places, they never go back into those mountains. Something in their eyes says they've seen something that changed their understanding of what's possible, what's real. So here's what we're left with: a census taker who tried to expose a conspiracy and uncovered something much worse. A people who were systematically erased from history, taking their knowledge with them. A wealthy man who may have made a bargain with something that shouldn't exist and who spent his final years expanding its territory, and mountains that still hold secrets, still harbor places where the normal rules don't quite apply, where something waits in the hollow spaces, patient and persistent, learning about our world one encounter at a time. Mordecai Ashford's story ended in a charity hospital in Memphis, but what he discovered in the mountains of Tennessee continues. The hollow places are still there, still growing, still expanding their territory every time someone who doesn't know the rules disturbs them. The Melungeons who might have taught those rules are scattered now, their knowledge fragmented and dismissed. And whatever Gideon Ravenscroft helped unleash has had over a century to learn, to adapt, to understand how to move through our world more effectively. So let me ask you this. When you hear about unexplained disappearances in remote areas, when you read about places where people consistently report strange phenomena, do you ever wonder if there's a pattern? If maybe the spots on the map where reality seems to bend aren't random anomalies, but purposeful manifestations of something that's been expanding its presence steadily, methodically, for longer than any of us have been alive? And here's the truly disturbing part, the thing Mordecai realized in his final journal entry. The Melungeons weren't special. They weren't the only people who knew about the hollow places. They were just the ones in Appalachia. There are similar groups scattered throughout the world. Indigenous populations, isolated communities, people who live in proximity to areas where the veil between worlds is thin and who've developed traditions and taboos to protect themselves. And everywhere, those people are being displaced, their knowledge dismissed as superstition, the places they've avoided being developed by people who don't understand why they should be left alone. What if all of it, the whole process of modernization and expansion and development, has been helping something spread, not through any conscious conspiracy, but simply because we've stopped listening to the people who knew where not to go, who understood that some places need to remain untouched, not for mystical reasons or to preserve wilderness, but because disturbing them creates openings, opportunities for things that live in spaces adjacent to our reality to find their way in. Mordecai died believing he'd failed, that his attempt to help the Melungeons had only made things worse, that his investigation had drawn attention to them and accelerated their persecution. But maybe his real failure was in focusing on the political conspiracy and not taking the supernatural elements seriously enough. Maybe if he'd written his story differently, if he'd emphasized the warnings about the hollow places instead of the crimes of Gideon Ravenscroft, someone might have listened. Someone might have understood what was really at stake, but he didn't. And now, more than a century later, we're still dealing with the consequences. The Melungeons have their recognition. Their DNA has been studied, their genealogies traced. But their warnings about the hollow places, those are filed away as folklore. Interesting stories, but not actionable intelligence. And meanwhile, the places they warned about continue to expand, continue to claim victims, continue to adapt to our modern world, finding new ways to manifest, new methods of drawing people in. The last confirmed sighting of Mordecai Ashford was in Memphis in March of 1904. But there have been rumors over the years, stories told in the mountains of Appalachia about a figure sometimes seen near the old hollow places, thin and gaunt, dressed in clothes from another era, watching, always watching, as if whatever took him is using him now, using his knowledge of our world to understand how to expand more effectively, how to draw people in, how to spread. Those stories are probably just folklore too, the kind of legend that grows up around any mysterious disappearance. But every so often, someone camping in those mountains will report seeing a man who matches the description, standing at the edge of their camp, silent, observing, and they'll say that he smelled like something they couldn't identify, something that didn't belong, and that when they looked away and looked back, he was gone. But the feeling of being watched remained, the sense that something had taken note of them, marked them in some way. Are those stories true? Probably not. Probably just the power of suggestion. People who've heard the legends seeing what they expect to see in the darkness and the isolation. But then again, the Melungeons spent generations living in those mountains, generations learning which places to avoid, which sounds not to investigate, which compulsions not to follow. And they were right about enough other things. About the systematic campaign to erase them, about the dangers of disturbing the hollow places, about the consequences of ignoring warnings that seem irrational until you understand the context behind them. Maybe they were right about this too. Maybe there is something in those mountains that takes people and uses them, that learns from them, that's patient enough to spend centuries expanding its territory one disturbed hollow at a time. Maybe Mordecai Ashford did become part of it, another tool it uses to interact with our world, to understand us, to grow. Or maybe it's all just stories, coincidence and tragedy, and the human need to find patterns in randomness. Maybe Gideon Ravenscroft was just a ruthless businessman who got lucky and died peacefully in his bed. Maybe Mordecai was simply a well-intentioned census taker who got caught up in something bigger than himself and paid the price. Maybe the Melungeons are just an interesting historical footnote, nothing more. But if you ever find yourself in the mountains of Appalachia and you come across a place where the silence feels wrong, where the trees grow twisted and strange, where every instinct tells you to turn back, even though you can't explain why. Maybe listen to those instincts. Maybe respect the warnings that generations of people learned to follow. Maybe remember that some knowledge gets dismissed as superstition right up until the moment you need it. And by then, it's usually too late to matter. So what do you think? Do you believe there are places in this world where reality works differently? Where something other than us has staked a claim? Leave your thoughts in the comments. And if you've had your own experiences in remote areas, places where things didn't feel quite right, share those too. Because maybe the real story isn't about what happened to one census taker in 1897. Maybe it's about what's still happening now, in mountains and forests and wild places where most people never go, where something patient is waiting, learning, growing, expanding into our world one hollow place at a time. Thanks for listening to this investigation into the forgotten people and the even more forgotten warnings they tried to preserve. If you found this exploration of hidden history compelling, there's more where this came from. Until next time, maybe think twice before wandering off the marked trails. The Melungeons knew why they avoided certain places. We've just forgotten to ask.